Mrs. Gorf, from Sideways Stories from Wayside School, by Louis Siccar. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher in Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th story. "If you children are bad," she warned, "or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples." Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count, but he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. "Hey, that isn't fair," said Todd. "John was only trying to help a friend." Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. "Does anyone else have an opinion?" she asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. "I do not allow crying in the classroom," said Mrs. Gorf. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet, and when they went home, they were too scared even to talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf just left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, "God bless you," when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. Terrence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Maricia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door as Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear wiggled. Maricia opened the door and had one foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue. Maricia became an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The 3 Erics laughed. They were turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terrence, Maricia, and the 3 Erics, Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Ovens. Louis, the art teacher, walked into the classroom. He had missed the children at recess. He had heard Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. "I must be wrong," he thought. "She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples." He walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Louis, the art teacher, came back into the room. He saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in the class. She must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all of the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. "Now I can go home," she said. "I don't have to teach anymore. I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again." "You're not going anywhere!" shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor. The apples jumped all over her. "Stop!" she shouted, "or I'll turn you into applesauce!" But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. "Turn us back into children," Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, this time her left one here, then her right, and turned the apples back into children. "All right," said Mauricia. "Let's go get Louie. He'll know what to do." "No!" screamed Mrs. Gorf. "I'll turn you back into apples." She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, and stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple, but none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Louie, the yard teacher, walked in. "Where's Mrs. Gorf?" he asked. Nobody said a word. "Boy, am I hungry," said Louie. "I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many." He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it up on his shirt, and ate it.
Welcome back, guys. It's our second day of class, and I wanted to talk to you briefly about today's work. So, if you remember, hopefully you're already here, but if you go into the classwork tab and open Wednesday and click View Assignment, you'll see today's instructions. So, if you haven't already done so, make sure you do the attendance bell work. Then it's going to instruct you to watch the video, play Kahoot, remember your score for the ticket, and to complete the Mrs. Gorf exit ticket. Now, what I want to show you right now is Kahoot, where it says play Kahoot, remember your score for the ticket. If you click on play Kahoot, it's going to take you to the Kahoot game I've set up for you. It's going to ask you to choose a nickname. That does mean you're not choosing. So one more time, please remember your score. And my nickname today is Classy Swan. Which character is this? Now, I hope you know who this is, but you'll notice there isn't a timer on these questions. So if you're not sure, instead of guessing and moving on, it's okay to go back and look again at the story. You can go back, open up the story, and find the answer, and come back, and you won't lose any points. So that's not me. That is Mrs. Gorf. All right, so I'm not going to give you guys any more answers. One more time, sure hope you could tell the difference between me and Mrs. Gorf. But after you play Kahoot, don't forget, come back, fill out the exit ticket. Remember that score. So I will see you guys again tomorrow.